Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 121, Midnight. The Forecastle Bulwarks. Stubb and Flask climbed onto the anchors and added more lashings. No, Stubb. You can hit that knot as much as you want, but you'll never convince me of what you just said. How long ago was it when you said the opposite? Didn't you once say that any ship Ahab sails on should pay extra for insurance, just like it was loaded with gunpowder in the back and matches in the front? Come on, didn't you say that? Well, so what if I did? I've changed since then. Why can't my mind change too? Besides, even if we were loaded with gunpowder and matches, how could the matches catch fire in this soaking spray? Listen, little buddy, you have pretty red hair, but you wouldn't catch fire now. Shake yourself off. You're like Aquarius, the water bearer. You could fill pitchers from your collar. Don't you see that for these extra risks, marine insurance companies require extra guarantees? Here are the hydrants, Flask. But wait, let me answer your other point. First, take your leg off the anchor so I can pass the rope. Now listen. What's the big difference between holding a lightning rod during a storm and standing near a mast that doesn't have one during a storm? Can't you see, you blockhead, that nothing can happen to the person holding the rod unless the mast gets struck first? What are you talking about? Not one ship in 100 carries lightning rods, and Ahab, and all of us, are no more in danger now than the crews of 10,000 ships sailing the seas. You, King Post, would probably want every man in the world to walk around with a small lightning rod sticking up from the corner of his hat, like a militia officer's feather, trailing behind like a sash. Why don't you be sensible, Flask? It's easy to be sensible, so why don't you? Anyone with half a brain can be sensible. I'm not so sure, Stubb. Sometimes it's pretty tough. Yeah, when someone is soaking wet, it's hard to think clearly, that's for sure. And I'm soaked from this spray. Never mind. Just catch that turn and pass it. It feels like we're tying these anchors down as if they'll never be used again. Lashing these anchors down feels like tying a man's hands behind his back. And what big, strong hands they are. These are your iron fists, right? They've got quite a grip. I wonder, Flask, if the world is anchored anywhere. If it is, it must be swinging on an unusually long cable. There, hammer that knot down, and we're done. Next to touching land, being lit on deck is the most satisfying feeling. Can you wring out my jacket tails? Thanks. They laugh at long coats like this, Flask, but it seems to me a long-tailed coat should always be worn in a storm at sea. The tails taper down like this to carry off the water, you see? It's the same with cocked hats. The cocked part acts like eavesdrops. No more monkey jackets and tarpaulins for me. I want to wear a swallowtail coat and a beaver hat. Oh, there goes my tarpaulin overboard. Goodness, it's rude for winds from heaven to be so rough. This is a terrible night, lad. Chapter 122. Midnight Aloft. Thunder and lightning. The maintop sail yard, tash to go, wrapping new lashings around it. Ugh, stop that thunder. There's way too much thunder up here. What's the point of it? Ugh, we don't want thunder. We want rum. Give us a glass of rum. Ugh! Chapter 123. The Musket. During the most violent shocks of the typhoon, the man at the Pequod's jawbone tiller was thrown to the deck multiple times by its erratic movements. Even though preventer tackles had been attached to it, they were loose because some give in the tiller was necessary. In a severe storm like this, while the ship is tossed around like a shuttlecock in the wind, it's not uncommon to see the compass needles spinning wildly. The same thing happened with the Pequods. With each shock, the helmsman noticed how fast they whirled on the compass cards. It's a sight that usually stirs strong emotions in anyone who sees it. A few hours after midnight, the typhoon calmed down enough that with Starbuck and Stubb's hard work, one at the front and the other at the back, the damaged jib and fore and main topsails were cut loose from the spars and blown away like feathers from an albatross that have been scattered by the wind. The 3 new sails were quickly rigged and reefed, and a storm trysail was set further aft, allowing the ship to move through the water more steadily again. The course, east-southeast if possible, was given back to the helmsman, as during the worst of the gale, he had been steering based on the wind's changes. As he tried to bring the ship back on course, watching the compass, he noticed a good sign. The wind seemed to be shifting in his favor. Indeed, the unfavorable breeze had turned fair. Immediately, the yards were squared, accompanied by the cheerful song, "Ho, the fair wind! Oh, ya-ho, cheerly men!" The crew sang joyfully that such a promising change had come so soon after the earlier bad signs. Following his captain's standing order to report any significant changes on deck at any hour, Starbuck reluctantly trimmed the sails to the wind and then went below deck to inform Captain Ahab of the situation. Before knocking on the cabin door, he paused for a moment. The cabin lamp swung back and forth, flickering and casting shadows on the old man's bolted door, a thin door with fixed blinds instead of upper panels. The cabin's isolation created a peculiar, humming silence, despite the roar of the storm outside. The loaded muskets in the rack gleamed as they stood upright against the bulkhead. Starbuck was an honest, upright man. Yet, at that moment, seeing the muskets, a troubling thought crept into his mind, mixed with its neutral or good aspects, making him hardly recognize it for what it was. "He would have shot me once," he murmured. "Yes, there's the very musket he pointed at me, the one with the studded stock. Let me touch it, pick it up. It's strange that I, who have handled so many deadly lances, should be shaking now. Is it loaded? I need to check. Yes, it is, and there's powder in the pan. That's not good. Should I spill it? No, wait. I'll be brave and hold the musket while I think. I'm here to report a fair wind to him. But how fair? Fair for death and doom. That's fair for Moby Dick. It's a fair wind that only favors that cursed whale. The very tube he pointed at me, the very one, this one. I'm holding it now. He would have killed me with the very thing I'm handling. Aye, and he would be willing to kill all his crew. Doesn't he say he won't strike his spars in any gale? Didn't he smash his precious quadrant? And in these dangerous seas, doesn't he navigate by the faulty estimates of the log? And in this very typhoon, didn't he swear to avoid lightning rods? But should this crazed old man be allowed to lead an entire ship's crew to their doom with him? Yes, he would be the willful murderer of 30 men or more if this ship comes to any harm, and my soul swears this ship will come to harm if Ahab has his way. If he were to be removed right now, that crime would not be his. Is he mumbling in his sleep? Yes, there he is, asleep. Asleep? Yes, but still alive, and he'll wake up again soon. I can't resist you, old man. You won't listen to reason. You won't heed any objections or pleas. All you care about is absolute obedience to your commands. Aye, and you say the men have vowed to follow you. You say we're all Ahabs now. God forbid. But is there no other way? No lawful way? Should I make him a prisoner and take him home? What? Hope to wrest this old man's power from his own hands? Only a fool would try it. Even if he were tied up with ropes and hawsers, chained to the floor of this cabin, he would be more terrifying than a caged tiger. I couldn't bear to see that. I couldn't stand his howls. All comfort, all reason, and even sleep would leave me on this long, unbearable journey. What remains? The land is hundreds of leagues away, and Japan is the closest land. I stand alone on an open sea, with 2 oceans and a whole continent between me and the law. Aye, it is so. Is heaven a murderer when lightning strikes a would-be murderer in his bed, burning sheets and skin together? And would I be a murderer if, slowly, stealthily, half-turning, he pressed the musket against the door? On this level, Ahab's hammock swings inside. His head is this way. Just a touch, and Starbuck may survive to hug his wife and child again. Oh, Mary, Mary, boy, boy, boy. But if I don't wake you to death, old man, who can say to what unfathomable depths Starbuck's body might sink this time next week, along with all the crew? Great God, where are you? Should I? Should I? The wind has calmed and shifted, sir. The fore and main topsails are reefed and set. She's heading her course. Stand back. Oh, Moby Dick, I've finally got your heart in my grasp. These were the sounds that erupted from the old man's tortured sleep, as if Starbuck's voice had brought the long silent dream back to life. The musket shook like a drunkard's arm against the door panel. Starbuck seemed to be struggling with an angel, but turning away from the door, he put the weapon back in its rack and left the cabin. He's sleeping too soundly, Mr. Stubb. You go down and wake him and tell him. I need to take care of the deck here. You know what to say. Chapter 123. The Musket. During the most violent shocks of the typhoon, the man at the Pequod's jawbone tiller was thrown to the deck multiple times by its erratic movements. Even though preventer tackles had been attached to it, they were loose because some give in the tiller was necessary. In a severe storm like this, while the ship is tossed around like a shuttlecock in the wind, it's not uncommon to see the compass needles spinning wildly. The same thing happened with the Pequods. With each shock, the helmsman noticed how fast they whirled on the compass cards. It's a sight that usually stirs strong emotions in anyone who sees it. A few hours after midnight, the typhoon calmed down enough that with Starbuck and Stubbs' hard work, one at the front and the other at the back, the damaged jib and fore and main topsails were cut loose from the spars and blown away like feathers from an albatross that have been scattered by the wind. The 3 new sails were quickly rigged and reefed, and a storm trysail was set further aft, allowing the ship to move through the water more steadily again. The course, east-southeast, if possible, was given back to the helmsman, as during the worst of the gale he had been steering based on the wind's changes. As he tried to bring the ship back on course, watching the compass, he noticed a good sign. The wind seemed to be shifting in his favor. Indeed, the unfavorable breeze had turned fair. Immediately, the yards were squared, accompanied by the cheerful song, "Ho, the fair wind! Oh, yea ho, cheerly men!" The crew sang joyfully that such a promising change had come so soon after the earlier bad signs. Following his captain's standing order to report any significant changes on deck at any hour, Starbuck reluctantly trimmed the sails to the wind and then went below deck to inform Captain Ahab of the situation. Before knocking on the cabin door, he paused for a moment. The cabin lamp swung back and forth, flickering and casting shadows on the old man's bolted door, a thin door with fixed blinds instead of upper panels. The cabin's isolation created a peculiar, humming silence, despite the roar of the storm outside. The loaded muskets in the rack gleamed as they stood upright against the bulkhead. Starbuck was an honest, upright man, yet at that moment, seeing the muskets, a troubling thought crept into his mind, mixed with its neutral or good aspects, making him hardly recognize it for what it was. "He would have shot me once," he murmured. "Yes, there's the very musket he pointed at me, the one with the studded stock. Let me touch it, pick it up. It's strange that I, who have handled so many deadly lances, should be shaking now. Is it loaded? I need to check. Yes, it is, and there's powder in the pan. That's not good. Should I spill it? No, wait. I'll be brave and hold the musket while I think. I'm here to report a fair wind to him. But how fair? Fair for death and doom. That's fair for Moby Dick. It's a fair wind that only favors that cursed whale. The very tube he pointed at me. The very one. This one. I'm holding it now. He would have killed me with the very thing I'm handling. Aye, and he would be willing to kill all his crew. Doesn't he say he won't strike his spars in any gale? Didn't he smash his precious quadrant? And in these dangerous seas, doesn't he navigate by the faulty estimates of the log? And in this very typhoon, didn't he swear to avoid lightning rods? But should this crazed old man be allowed to lead an entire ship's crew to their doom with him? Yes, he would be the willful murderer of 30 men or more if this ship comes to any harm, and my soul swears this ship will come to harm if Ahab has his way. If he were to be removed right now, that crime would not be his. Is he mumbling in his sleep? Yes, there he is, asleep. Asleep? Yes, but still alive, and he'll wake up again soon. I can't resist you, old man. You won't listen to reason. You won't heed any objections or pleas. All you care about is absolute obedience to your commands. Aye, and you say the men have vowed to follow you. You say we're all Ahabs now. God forbid. But is there no other way? No lawful way? Should I make him a prisoner and take him home? What? Hope to wrest this old man's power from his own hands? Only a fool would try it. Even if he were tied up with ropes and hawsers, chained to the floor of this cabin, he would be more terrifying than a caged tiger. I couldn't bear to see that. I couldn't stand his howls. All comfort, all reason, and even sleep would leave me on this long, unbearable journey. What remains? The land is hundreds of leagues away, and Japan is the closest land. I stand alone on an open sea, with 2 oceans and a whole continent between me and the law. Aye, it is so. Is heaven a murderer when lightning strikes a would-be murderer in his bed, burning sheets and skin together? And would I be a murderer if... Slowly, stealthily, half-turning, he pressed the musket against the door. On this level, Ahab's hammock swings inside. His head is this way. Just a touch, and Starbuck may survive to hug his wife and child again. Oh, Mary, Mary, boy, boy, boy. But if I don't wake you to death, old man, who can say to what unfathomable depths Starbuck's body might sink this time next week along with all the crew? Great God, where are you? Should I? Should I? The wind has calmed and shifted, sir. The fore and main topsails are reefed and set. She's heading her course. Stand back! Oh, Moby Dick, I've finally got your heart in my grasp. These were the sounds that erupted from the old man's tortured sleep, as if Starbuck's voice had brought the long, silent dream back to life. The musket shook like a drunkard's arm against the door panel. Starbuck seemed to be struggling with an angel, but turning away from the door, he put the weapon back in its rack and left the cabin. He's sleeping too soundly, Mr. Stubb. You go down and wake him and tell him. I need to take care of the deck here. You know what to say. Chapter 124. The Needle. The next morning, the sea still rolled in long, slow waves of immense size, pushing the Pequod along as if by the outstretched palms of giants. The strong, steady breeze filled the sails so much that the sky and air seemed to be vast, inflated sails. The whole world resonated with the wind. Wrapped in the bright morning light, the sun was only known by the intensity of its rays, which moved in stacks ahead of the ship. It felt like the sea was a crucible of molten gold, bubbling with light and heat. Ahab stood apart in an enchanted silence. Every time the ship pitched down with her bowsprit, he turned to look at the bright rays of the sun ahead, and when the ship settled by the stern, he looked back and saw the sun's position behind him, noticing how the same yellow rays mixed with his steady wake. Ha! My ship! You could be mistaken for the sun's chariot. Ho, ho! All you nations in front of my bow, I bring the sun to you. Yoke on the far waves, huzzah! I drive the sea. But suddenly interrupted by another thought, he hurried to the helm, asking huskily how the ship was heading. East-southeast, sir, replied the frightened steersman. You're lying, Ahab shouted, striking him with his fist. Heading east at this hour in the morning with the sun behind us? Everyone was taken aback. Ahab's observation had inexplicably escaped everyone else, but its blinding clarity must have been the reason for it. Leaning halfway into the binnacle, Ahab caught a glimpse of the compasses. His arm dropped slowly. For a moment, he seemed almost to stagger. Starbuck stood behind him and saw that while the two compasses pointed east, the Pequod was undeniably heading west. Before the alarm could spread among the crew, the old man let out a stiff laugh and exclaimed, I've got it! This has happened before. Mr. Starbuck, last night's thunder must have turned our compasses. That's all. You've heard of such things, haven't you? Aye, but it's never happened to me before, sir, replied the pale mate gloomily. It must be noted that accidents like this have indeed occurred to ships in violent storms. The magnetic energy in the mariner's needle is essentially the same as the electricity observed in the sky. Therefore, it's not surprising that such events occur. There have been instances where lightning struck a vessel, damaging some of the spars and rigging, and the effect on the needle can be even more severe, wiping out its magnetic properties. As a result, the once magnetic steel becomes as useless as an old woman's knitting needle. But in either case, the needle never recovers its original virtue on its own, and if the binnacle compasses are affected, the same fate befalls all others on the ship, even if the lowest one is placed in the keel. Standing deliberately before the binnacle and eyeing the reversed compasses, the old man used his extended hand to gauge the exact position of the sun. Satisfied that the needles were indeed inverted, he shouted orders to change the ship's course accordingly. The sails were raised, and once again the Pequod thrust her unwavering bow into the opposing wind, as the supposed fair wind had only been misleading her. Meanwhile, regardless of his own thoughts, Starbuck said nothing but quietly issued all necessary orders, while Stubb and Flask, who seemed to share some of his feelings, also went along quietly. As for the crew, although some grumbled quietly, their fear of Ahab was greater than their fear of fate. But as always, the pagan harpooners remained mostly unfazed, or if they were impressed, it was only by the magnetism emanating from the unyielding Ahab. For a while, the old man walked the deck in a daze. But when he happened to slip with his ivory heel, he noticed the crushed copper sight tubes of the quadrant he had smashed to the deck the day before. You poor, proud observer of the heavens and the sun's pilot. Yesterday I wrecked you. and today the compasses would have wrecked me. So. But Ahab is still master of the magnetic needle. Mr. Starbuck, a lance without a pole, a top maul, and the smallest of the sailmaker's needles. Quick! Perhaps influenced by a desire to boost the spirits of his crew through an act of skill regarding the peculiar situation with the compasses, the old man understood that steering by the reversed needles, though possible, wouldn't be taken lightly by superstitious sailors without causing fear and bad omens. "Men," he said, turning steadily to the crew as the mate handed him the items he had requested. "The thunder turned old Ahab's needles, but from this piece of steel, Ahab can create one of his own that will point as true as any." The sailors exchanged abashed glances of wonder at this proclamation, and with eager eyes they awaited whatever magic might follow. But Starbuck looked away. With a blow from the top maul, Ahab knocked off the steel head of the lance, then handed the long iron rod to the mate and instructed him to hold it upright without touching the deck. After repeatedly striking the upper end of the iron rod, he placed the blunt end of the needle on top and hammered it several times while the mate still held the rod as before. Then, going through some strange motions, whether necessary for magnetizing the steel or merely to heighten the crew's awe is uncertain, he called for linen thread, and moving to the binnacle, he pulled out the two reversed needles and suspended the sail needle horizontally over one of the compass cards. At first, the steel spun around and vibrated at both ends, but eventually it settled into place, and Ahab, who had been watching intently, stepped back from the binnacle and pointed to it, exclaiming, "Look for yourselves, if Ahab is not master of the magnetic needle. The sun is east, and that compass swears it." One by one they peered in, as nothing but their own eyes could convince them of such ignorance, and one by one they slunk away. In his fiery eyes of scorn and triumph, you could see Ahab in all his tragic pride. Chapter 125. The Log and Line. As the doomed Pequod had been at sea for a while, the log and line had rarely been used. Because they relied confidently on other methods to determine the ship's position, many merchant ships and whalers, especially when cruising, completely neglected to use the log. They would often write down the course the ship was steering and the estimated average speed each hour, but it was more for show than anything else. This was the case with the Pequod. The wooden reel and angular log hung untouched just beneath the railing of the after bulwarks. Rain and spray had dampened it, sun and wind had warped it, and the elements had combined to rot something that hung there so idly. But Ahab, oblivious to all of this, suddenly remembered his oath about the log and line as he glanced at the reel not long after the incident with the magnets. The ship was sailing heavily. Waves rolled in behind her. "Forward there! Heave the log!" Two sailors approached, the golden-skinned Tahitian and the grizzled Manxman. "One of you take the reel. I'll heave," Ahab ordered. They moved to the far stern on the ship's leeward side, where the deck was almost dipping into the rushing, foamy sea due to the wind's angle. The Manxman took the reel, holding it high by the handle ends of the spindle, with the log hanging down until Ahab came to him. Ahab stood in front of him, lightly unwinding 30 or 40 turns to form a coil to toss overboard, when the old Manxman, intently watching both Ahab and the line, spoke up. "Sir, I don't trust it. This line looks worn out. Long exposure to heat and water has damaged it." "It'll hold, old man. Has heat and water damaged you? You seem to be holding up just fine. Or maybe it's life that's holding you, not the other way around." "I'm holding the spool, sir, but just as my captain says, with these gray hairs of mine, it's not worth arguing, especially with a superior who will never admit he's wrong." "What's that?" "Here's a patched-up professor in Queen Nature's College founded on granite, but he seems too subservient. Where were you born?" "In the little rocky Isle of Man, sir." "Excellent. You've made it in the world by that." "I don't know, sir. I was just born there." "In the Isle of Man? Huh? Well, that's good. Here's a man from Man. A man born in what was once an independent man, now stripped of independence. Sucked in by what? Up with the reel. The dead, blind wall blocks all questioning minds in the end. Up with it." The log was thrown overboard. The loose coils quickly straightened out into a long, dragging line behind the ship, and the reel started to spin. The rolling waves jerked the line up and down, causing the old reelman to stagger. "Hold hard!" Snap! The overstrained line sagged into a long loop. The dragging log was gone. I crush the quadrant, the thunder turns the needles, and now the mad sea parts the log line. But Ahab can fix everything. Haul in here, Tishan. Reel up, Manxman. And make sure the carpenter creates another log and repairs the line. Get on it. There he goes now. To him, nothing's happened. But to me, it feels like the world is falling apart. Haul in, Tahitian. These lines run out whole and spinning and come back broken and dragging. Pip. Pip? Who are you calling Pip? Pip jumped from the whaleboat. Pip's missing. Let's see if you haven't fished him up here, fisherman. It's dragging hard. I guess he's holding on. Jerk him in, Tahitian. Pull him in. We don't haul in cowards here. Ho, there's his arm just breaking the surface. A hatchet! A hatchet! Cut it off. We don't haul in cowards here. Captain Ahab, here's Pip, trying to get back on board. Be quiet, you crazy fool, the Manxman said, grabbing him by the arm. Get away from the quarterdeck. The greater idiot always scolds the lesser, muttered Ahab, advancing. Hands off that holiness. Where do you say Pip was, boy? Astern there, sir, astern. Look. And who are you, boy? I can't see my reflection in your vacant eyes. Oh God, how can a man be a thing for immortal souls to sift through? Who are you, boy? Bellboy, sir, ship's crier. Ding dong ding. Pip, pip, pip. 100 pounds of clay reward for Pip. 5 feet tall. Looks cowardly. Known best by that. Ding dong ding. Who's seen Pip the coward? There can be no hearts above the snow line. Oh, you frozen heavens. Look down here. You gave birth to this unfortunate child and then abandoned him. You creative libertines. Here, boy, Ahab's cabin will be Pip's home from now on, while Ahab lives. You touch my innermost core, boy. You're tied to me by cords woven from my heartstrings. Come, let's go below. What's this? Here's velvet shark skin, he said, intently gazing at Ahab's hand and feeling it. Ah, if poor Pip had felt something so kind, perhaps he would never have been lost. This seems to me, sir, like a man-rope, something weak souls can hold on to. Oh, sir, let old Perth come and bind these 2 hands together, the black one with the white, for I won't let this go. Oh, boy, nor will I you, unless I drag you into worse horrors than what's here. Come, then, to my cabin. Look, you who believe in all goodness in gods and all evil in men, see the all-knowing gods indifferent to suffering humanity. And man, though foolish and not knowing what he does, is still full of love and gratitude. Come. I feel prouder leading you by your black hand than if I grasped an emperor's. There go 2 crazy ones now, muttered the old Manxman. One crazy with strength, the other crazy with weakness. But here's the end of the rotten line, all dripping too. Mend it, eh? I think we'd better get a whole new line. I'll talk to Mr. Stubb about it. Chapter 126. The Life-Buoy. Steering southeast by Ahab's carefully adjusted instruments and relying solely on Ahab's level log and line, the Pequod continued its course toward the equator. As they made their way through such rarely traveled waters, without sighting any ships, and soon pushed along by steady trade winds over consistently gentle waves, everything felt strangely calm, as if it were a prelude to something chaotic and desperate. Finally, as the ship approached the outskirts of the equatorial fishing grounds, navigating through the deep darkness just before dawn and passing a cluster of rocky islets, the watch led by Flask was startled by a cry that was hauntingly wild and otherworldly, like the half-formed wails of the ghosts of all the innocent children killed by Herod. The crew snapped out of their daydreams and stood, sat, or leaned, all transfixed, listening intently, as if they were carved Roman slaves, while that eerie cry lingered in the air. The Christian or civilized members of the crew believed it was mermaids and shuddered at the thought, while the pagan harpooneers remained unfazed. However, the old Manxman, the oldest sailor of all, claimed that the chilling sounds they heard were the voices of newly drowned men in the sea. Ahab, below in his hammock, didn't hear about this until dawn when he came to the deck. Flask recounted the incident, hinting at darker meanings. Ahab hollowly laughed and explained the phenomenon. The rocky islands they had passed were home to many seals, and some young seals that had lost their mothers, or mothers that had lost their pups, must have surfaced near the ship, crying and sobbing with a human-like wail. This affected some of the crew more deeply because many sailors hold superstitions about seals, stemming from their unique cries when in distress, and their human-like faces peering out of the water alongside the ship. In certain situations, seals have even been mistaken for men. But the crew's ominous feelings were about to receive a striking confirmation with the fate of one of their own that morning. At sunrise, this man went from his hammock to the top of the mast. Whether he was still groggy from sleep, as sailors sometimes go aloft in a dazed state, is uncertain. However, he hadn't been at his post long before a cry was heard, a shout and a rush, and looking up, they saw a phantom falling through the air. Looking down, they saw a small cluster of white bubbles in the blue sea. The life-buoy, a long, slender barrel, was dropped from the stern where it always hung ready to be deployed. But no one reached for it, and after the sun had beaten down on the barrel for a long time, it had shrunk, slowly filling up, and the dry wood soaked up water at every pore. The barrel, reinforced with iron, sank after the sailor, as if to offer him a hard pillow. Thus, the first man from the Pequod to climb the mast in search of the white whale on its own territory was swallowed by the sea. Few likely thought about it at the time. In fact, they weren't particularly saddened by the event. They didn't view it as an omen of future misfortune, but rather as the fulfillment of an evil they already anticipated. They believed they now understood the wild shrieks they had heard the night before. But the old Manxman disagreed. Now the lost life-buoy needed to be replaced. Starbuck was tasked with that. But since they couldn't find a buoy light enough, and with the feverish urgency of what seemed like the impending climax of their voyage, everyone was impatient with any work that wasn't directly related to that final goal, whatever it may be. So they were about to leave the ship's stern without a buoy when Queequeg made a peculiar hint about his coffin. "A life buoy, made from a coffin!" Starbuck exclaimed, startled. "That's rather strange, I'd say," said Stubb. "It will be good enough," Flask replied. "The carpenter can easily arrange it." "Bring it up. There's no other option," Starbuck said after a gloomy pause. "Make it, carpenter. Don't look at me like that. The coffin, I mean. Do you hear me? Make it." "And should I nail down the lid, sir?" he asked, mimicking a hammering motion. "Yes." "And should I caulk the seams, sir?" Mimicking a caulking motion. "Yes." "And should I then cover it with pitch, sir?" he continued, mimicking pouring pitch. "Stop! What's gotten into you? Just make a life buoy from the coffin and nothing more. Mr. Stubb, Mr. Flask, come forward with me." He storms off in a huff. He can take the whole thing, but when it comes to the parts, he balks. "I don't like this. I can craft a leg for Captain Ahab, and he wears it like a gentleman. But I make a box for Queequeg, and he won't put his head in it. Are all my efforts to go to waste with that coffin? And now I'm being told to make a life buoy from it. It's like flipping an old coat inside out. It'll just bring the flesh to the other side. I don't like this cobbling business. I don't like it at all. It's undignified. It's not my place. Let the tinker's kids do the tinkering. We're their betters. I prefer to handle only clean, neat jobs. Something that starts at the beginning, is in the middle when it's midway, and ends at the conclusion. Not a cobbler's job that ends in the middle and begins at the end. It's the old woman's trick to give cobbling jobs. Goodness. What an affection all old women have for tinkers. I know a 65-year-old woman who once ran off with a bald-headed young tinker. And that's why I never worked for lonely widow old women on shore when I had my job shop in the vineyard. They might have taken it into their lonely heads to run off with me. But alas, there are no caps at sea, but snow caps. Let's see. Nail down the lid, caulk the seams, cover them with pitch, fasten them down tight, and hang it with the snap spring over the ship's stern. Have such things ever been done before with a coffin? Some superstitious old carpenters would be tied up in the rigging before they do that. But I'm made of tough Aroostook hemlock. I won't budge. Bound with a coffin. Sailing around with a graveyard tray. But never mind. We woodworkers create bridal beds and card tables as well as coffins and hearses. We work by the month, by the job, or for profit. We don't ask the why and wherefore of our work unless it's too much like cobbling, and then we stash it if we can. I'll do the job now, carefully. Let's see. How many crew members are there in total? I've forgotten. Anyway, I'll make 30 separate lifelines, each 3 feet long, hanging all around the coffin. Then, if the hull goes down, 30 lively fellows will all fight for one coffin, a sight not often seen under the sun. Come on, hammer, caulking iron, pitch pot, and marling spike. Let's get to work. Chapter 127. The Deck. The coffin rested on two lined tubs between the workbench and the open hatchway, with the carpenter busy caulking its seams. A long string of twisted oakum unwound from a large roll tucked into the front of his frock. Ahab slowly emerged from the cabin and heard Pip following him. Go back, boy. I'll be with you again shortly. He's leaving. No one understands my mood better than that boy. What's this in the middle of the aisle? A life-buoy, sir. Mr. Starbuck's orders. Oh, look out, sir. Watch the hatchway. Thank you, man. Your coffin is close to the vault. Sir? The hatchway? Oh, yes it is, sir. Yes it is. Aren't you the leg maker? Didn't this stump come from your shop? I believe it did, sir. Does the ferrule hold up, sir? Well enough. But aren't you also the undertaker? Yes, sir. I put this together as a coffin for Queequeg, but now they've got me turning it into something else. Then tell me, are you not a greedy, meddling, monopolizing, heathenish old scamp, making legs one day, coffins to put them in the next, and now life buoys from those same coffins? You're as unprincipled as the gods and a total jack of all trades. But I don't mean anything by it, sir. I just do what I do. The gods again. Tell me, don't you ever sing while working on a coffin? They say the Titans hummed while carving out the craters for volcanoes, and the gravedigger in the play sings while holding his spade. Don't you ever sing? Sing, sir? Do I sing? Oh, I'm indifferent to that, sir, but the reason the gravedigger made music must have been because there was none in his spade, sir. But the caulking mallet is full of it. Listen to it. Yes, and that's because the lid acts like a sounding board, and what makes the sounding board is this: there's nothing underneath. Yet a coffin with a body inside sounds pretty much the same, carpenter. Have you ever helped carry a bier and heard the coffin knock against the churchyard gate as it went in? Indeed, sir, I have. Indeed? What does that mean? Well, sir, it's just a sort of exclamation. That's all, sir. Go on. I was about to say, sir, that... Are you a silkworm? Do you spin your own shroud from yourself? Look at your bosom. Hurry, get these things out of sight. He heads toward the back. That was abrupt, but storms come quickly in hot climates. I've heard that Albemarle Island, one of the Galapagos, is right on the equator. It seems to me that some sort of equator cuts through that old man, too, right in the middle. He's always under the line. Fiery hot, I tell you. He's looking this way. Come on, Oakum, quickly. Here we go again. This wooden mallet is like the cork, and I'm the professor of musical glasses. Tap, tap, Ahab said to himself. Now that's something. There's a sound. The gray-headed woodpecker tapping the hollow tree. Blind and mute might be envied now. Look, that thing rests on two lined tubs full of tow lines. What a mischievous fellow. Rat-tat, just like how man's seconds tick. Oh, how insubstantial all materials are. What real things exist but thoughts that can't be weighed. Here's the very dreaded symbol of grim death, accidentally turned into a sign of help and hope for endangered life. A life buoy made from a coffin. Does it go deeper? Could it be that, in some spiritual sense, a coffin is really a preserver of immortality? I'll think about that. But no, I'm so caught up in the dark side of life that its brighter side seems like nothing but uncertain twilight to me. Will you never stop, carpenter, with that damned sound? I'm going below. Let me not see that thing here when I return. Now, Pip, let's talk this over. I draw the most wonderful philosophies from you. Some unknown channels from unknown worlds must flow into you. Chapter 128. The Pequod meets the Rachel. The next day, a large ship named the Rachel was spotted, heading straight toward the Pequod, with men crowded all over her masts. The Pequod was moving quickly through the water, but as the wind-driven ship approached, its sails suddenly collapsed like burst balloons, and all life seemed to leave its battered hull. Bad news. She's bringing bad news, muttered the old Manx man. But before her captain, standing in his boat with a trumpet in hand, could call out hopefully, Ahab's voice rang out. Have you seen the white whale? Yes, yesterday. Have you seen a whaleboat drifting? Suppressing his excitement, Ahab answered the unexpected question with a negative. He wanted to board the stranger's ship when the captain himself, having halted his vessel, was seen climbing down the side. With a few strong pulls, he hooked onto the Pequod's main chains and jumped onto the deck. Ahab recognized him as a Nantucketer he knew, but they didn't exchange formal greetings. Where was he? Not killed! Not killed! Ahab cried, stepping closer. What happened? It turned out that late the previous afternoon, while 3 of the Rachel's boats were chasing a school of whales several miles from the ship, Moby Dick suddenly appeared, not far away. The 4th boat, a reserve one, was immediately lowered to chase him. After a swift sail before the wind, that 4th boat, the fastest of all, seemed to have made contact, at least as far as the man at the masthead could tell. He saw the small, distant boat, and then a quick flash of bubbling white water, but then nothing more. It was concluded that the wounded whale must have swum away with its pursuers, which often happens. There was some worry, but no real alarm yet. The ship sent up recall signals, darkness fell, and they had to retrieve their 3 boats far to windward before going in search of the 4th, which was in the exact opposite direction. Because of this, the ship had to leave that boat behind until almost midnight and temporarily increase the distance from it. But when the rest of her crew was finally safe aboard, she set all sails, stunsail on stunsail, in pursuit of the missing boat, lighting a fire in her trypots as a beacon, and every other man went aloft to look out. Even though she sailed far enough to reach the presumed location of the missing crew, paused to lower her spare boats to search around her, and found nothing, she continued on until dawn. Yet not a glimpse of the missing boat was seen. After the story was told, the captain of the Rachel revealed why he had boarded the Pequod. He wanted Ahab's ship to join his own in the search, sailing about 4 or 5 miles apart, parallel to each other, to cover more ground. "I'll bet you something," whispered Stubb to Flask, "that someone in that missing boat took that captain's best coat, maybe his watch. He's so eager to get it back. Who's ever heard of 2 whaling ships searching for one missing whale boat in the middle of whaling season? Look, Flask, see how pale he looks, pale even in the buttons of his eyes. Look, it wasn't the coat, it must have been the... My boy, my own boy is among them. For God's sake, I beg you, I implore you," the stranger captain exclaimed to Ahab, who had remained cold to his request up to this point. "For 48 hours, let me charter your ship. I will gladly pay for it, and I'll pay generously, if there's no other way, for just 48 hours, only that. You must do this." "It's his son he's lost," cried Stubb. "I take back the coat and watch. What do you say, Ahab? We must save that boy." "He's drowned with the others," said the old Manx sailor standing behind them. "I heard it. All of you heard their spirits." As it turned out, what made the Rachel's situation even sadder was that not only was one of the captain's sons missing, but another son was also among the crews of the other boats that had separated from the ship during the chaotic chase. This left the poor father in deep despair, which was only resolved when his first mate instinctively adopted the standard procedure for whaling ships in such emergencies. When faced with the choice of saving divided boats, always pick up the majority first. However, the captain, for some unknown reason, had refrained from mentioning all this until Ahab's coldness forced him to bring up his other missing boy, a little lad of only 12 years old, whose father, with the earnest but unwary bravery of a Nantucketer's love, had tried to introduce him to the dangers and wonders of a profession that had been the destiny of their family for generations. It's not uncommon for Nantucket captains to send their young sons away on long voyages in other ships, so their first experience of life as a whaleman is not tainted by their father's natural but premature worries. Meanwhile, the stranger continued to plead his case to Ahab, who stood like an anvil, absorbing every blow without flinching. "I won't leave," said the stranger, "until you agree. Treat me as you would want to be treated in the same situation. You have a son, too, Captain Ahab, though he's just a child, safe at home now. Yes, a child of your old age. Yes, you're softening. I can see it. Run, men, now, and prepare to square the yards." "Stop," Ahab shouted. "Don't touch a rope." Then, in a voice that stretched out each word, he said, "Captain Gardner, I will not do it. I'm wasting time. Goodbye. God bless you, man, and may I forgive myself, but I must go. Mr. Starbuck, check the binnacle watch, and in 3 minutes warn off all strangers. Then brace forward again and let the ship sail as before." Turning quickly with his face averted, he went down into his cabin, leaving the stranger captain stunned by Ahab's complete and utter rejection of his earnest request. But coming out of his shock, Gardner hurried to the side, more fell than stepped into his boat, and returned to his ship. Soon the two ships went their separate ways. As long as the Rachel was in view, she was seen to swing back and forth at every dark spot on the water. Her yards swung around, and she continued to tack starboard and larboard. Sometimes she fought against the waves, and other times they pushed her forward, while all the while her masts and yards were crowded with men, like three tall cherry trees when boys are picking cherries among the branches. But by her erratic course and sad, winding path, it was clear that this ship, which splashed with spray, still remained without comfort. She was Rachel weeping for her children because they were not. Chapter 129. The Cabin. Ahab is about to go on deck. Pip grabs his hand to follow. Boy, I tell you, you must not follow Ahab right now. There will come a time when Ahab wouldn't scare you away, yet wouldn't want you by him either. There's something in you, poor boy, that I feel is too healing for my condition. Like cures like, and for this hunt, my illness becomes my greatest desire for health. You stay below here, where they'll treat you as if you were the captain. Yes, boy, you can sit in my own special chair. You must be another screw added to it. No, you're not whole, sir. Don't just use me for your lost leg. Just walk on me, sir. I ask for nothing more, as long as I remain part of you. Oh, despite a million villains, this makes me a bigot in the unwavering loyalty of man, and a fool, and crazy, but I think the same cure applies to him too. He's becoming sane again. They tell me, sir, that Stubb once abandoned poor little Pip, whose drowned bones now show white against his black skin. But I will never abandon you, sir, like Stubb did him. Sir, I must go with you. If you keep talking to me like this, Ahab's resolve will weaken. I'm telling you no, it can't happen. Oh, good master! Cry like that, and I'll kill you. Be careful, for Ahab is also mad. Listen, and you'll often hear my ivory foot on the deck, and still know that I'm there. And now I'm leaving you. Your hand. I've met you. You're true, boy, just like the circumference is to its center. So may God bless you forever, and if it comes to that, may God save you forever, whatever may happen. Ahab leaves. Pip takes a step forward. He stood right here just a moment ago. I'm standing in his space, but I'm all alone. If only poor Pip were here, I could bear it, but he's missing. Pip! Ding dong ding! Who's seen Pip? He must be up here. Let's try the door. What? No lock, no bolt, no bar. Yet I can't open it. It must be the spell. He told me to stay here. Yes, and he said this chair was mine. So here I'll sit against the transom in the middle of the ship with all her keel and 3 masts before me. Here our old sailors say in their big 74s, great admirals sometimes sit at a table and boss around rows of captains and lieutenants. Ha! What's this? Epaulets! The epaulets are all crowding in. Pass the decanters around. Glad to see you all. Fill up, gentlemen. What a strange feeling it is now when a black boy is hosting white men in gold lace coats. Gentlemen, have you seen a boy named Pip? A little black lad, 5 feet tall with a hangdog look, cowardly. He jumped from a whaleboat once. Have you seen him? No? Well then, fill up again, captains, and let's drink to shame upon all cowards. I name no names. Shame upon them. Put 1 foot on the table. Shame upon all cowards. Hush! Up there, I hear Ivory. Oh, master! I feel so downhearted when you walk over me. But I'll stay here, even if this stern hits rocks, and if they break through, and if oysters come to join me. Chapter 130. The Hat. Now that the right time and place had come, after such a long preliminary voyage, Ahab, having searched all other whaling waters, seemed to have chased his enemy into a remote part of the ocean to kill him more securely there. He found himself near the exact latitude and longitude where he had received his painful injury, now that a ship had been reported that had actually encountered Moby Dick just the day before, and now that all his meetings with various ships consistently showed the demonic indifference with which the white whale attacked his hunters, regardless of whether they had sinned or not. At this moment, something in the old man's eyes was hard for weak souls to bear. Like the unsetting polar star, which maintains its steady, piercing gaze through the long, dark Arctic night, Ahab's purpose now shone down on the gloomy crew. It loomed over them so much that all their fears, doubts, and anxieties were forced to hide deep inside, unable to sprout even a single thought. During this ominous time, all humor, whether forced or natural, vanished. Stubb no longer tried to make anyone smile. Starbuck no longer tried to stop one. Joy and sorrow, hope and fear seemed ground down to dust, packed tightly in the mortar of Ahab's iron will. Like machines, they moved silently about the deck, fully aware that the old man's commanding gaze was upon them. But if you had looked closely during his more private moments, when he thought no one was watching, you would have seen that just as Ahab's eyes intimidated the crew, the mysterious gaze of the Parsee also intimidated him, or somehow, in some wild way, affected him at times. A strange aura began to surround the thin Fedallah. A constant shivering shook him, causing the men to look at him uncertainly, half doubting whether he was truly human or merely a trembling shadow cast upon the deck by some unseen being. That shadow was always present. For even at night, it was known that Fedallah never truly slept or went below deck. He would stand still for hours but never sat or leaned. His pale but remarkable eyes clearly communicated, "We two watchmen never rest." At no time, whether day or night, could the sailors step onto the deck unless Ahab was in front of them, either standing in his pivot hole or pacing the planks between two unchanging limits, the mainmast and the mizzen, or they would see him at the cabin stairs, 1 foot poised to step onto the deck, his hat slouched low over his eyes, so that no matter how motionless he stood, how many days and nights passed without him swinging in his hammock, they could never be sure if, hidden beneath that drooping hat, his eyes were truly closed, or if he was still watching them intently. It didn't matter if he stood there in the scuttle for a whole hour, and the dampness of the night gathered in beads of dew on his stone-like coat and hat. The clothes that the night had soaked would dry in the next day's sunshine. And so, day after day, night after night, he went no longer below deck. Whatever he needed from the cabin, he simply sent for. He ate in the open air, taking only 2 meals, breakfast and dinner. He never touched supper, nor did he shave his beard, which grew dark and tangled, like the roots of trees that have been uprooted but continue to grow idly at the base, though dead above ground. Though his entire life had become one long watch on deck, and although the Parsee's mysterious watch was uninterrupted like his own, they never seemed to speak to each other, one man to the other, unless some trivial matter required it. There seemed to be a powerful bond secretly connecting the two, but openly, to the awestruck crew, they appeared as far apart as the poles. If they happened to speak a word during the day, they were both silent at night, as far as any verbal exchange was concerned. At times, for hours on end, they stood apart in the starlight, Ahab in his scuttle, the Parsee by the main mast, but still fixedly gazing at each other, as if in the Parsee Ahab saw his thrown-away shadow, and in Ahab the Parsee saw his forsaken substance. And yet, somehow, Ahab, in his own self, as he revealed daily, hourly, and every moment to his subordinates, seemed an independent lord, the Parsee merely his servant. Yet again, both seemed to be bound together, driven by an unseen tyrant, the lean shadow alongside the solid rib. For whatever the Parsee was, all rib and keel was solid Ahab. At the first faint glimmer of dawn, his iron voice rang out from the back, "Man the mastheads!" And throughout the day, until after sunset and twilight, that same voice was heard every hour at the striking of the helmsman's bell, asking, "What do you see? Sharp! Sharp!" But after 3 or 4 days had passed, following the encounter with the child-seeking Rachel, and no spout had yet been seen, the monomaniacal old man seemed distrustful of his crew's loyalty, at least of nearly all except the pagan harpooneers. He even doubted whether Stubb and Flask might willingly overlook the sight he sought. But if these suspicions were really in his mind, he cleverly refrained from voicing them, even though his actions hinted at them. "I will have the first sight of the whale myself," he declared. "I, Ahab, must have the doubloon." With his own hands, he rigged a nest of basketed bowlines, and sending a hand aloft with a single sheaved block to secure it to the mainmast head, he received the 2 ends of the downward reeved rope. He attached one to his basket and prepared a pin for the other end to fasten it at the rail. Once that was done, with that end still in his hand and standing next to the pin, he looked around at his crew, sweeping his gaze from one to the next, lingering on Daggoo, Queequeg, and Tashtego, but avoiding Fedallah. Then he fixed his steady, trusting gaze on the chief mate and said, "Take the rope, sir. I'm giving it to you, Starbuck." After arranging himself in the basket, he signaled for them to hoist him up to his perch, with Starbuck being the one to secure the rope at the end, standing close to it afterward. Thus, with one hand clinging to the royal mast, Ahab gazed out at the sea for miles and miles, ahead, astern, on either side, within the wide, expanded circle visible from such a great height. When a sailor at sea is hoisted to a high place in the rigging where there's no foothold, they are supported by the rope. Under these circumstances, its secured end on deck is always entrusted to one man who has special responsibility for it. In such a maze of running rigging, whose different connections aloft cannot always be clearly seen from the deck, it would be a natural disaster if the hoisted sailor were to be carelessly cast adrift by the crew and fall into the sea. So Ahab's actions in this matter were not unusual. The only strange thing about them was that Starbuck, almost the only man who had ever dared to oppose him with any semblance of determination, and one of those whose loyalty he seemed to doubt somewhat. It was strange that this was the very man he chose to keep watch. He was freely putting his entire life in the hands of someone he otherwise distrusted. The first time Ahab was perched aloft, just 10 minutes after he had settled there, one of those red-billed, savage seahawks, which often fly uncomfortably close around the manned mastheads of whalemen in these waters, came swooping and screaming around his head in a whirlwind of rapid circles. Then it shot up 1,000 feet into the air, then spiraled downwards and whirled around his head again. But with his gaze fixed on the dim and distant horizon, Ahab seemed to pay no attention to the wild bird. Nor would anyone else have paid much attention to it, as it was not an uncommon sight. Only now, even the least observant eye seemed to see some sort of clever meaning in nearly everything. Your hat, sir!" suddenly cried the Sicilian seaman, who was posted at the mizzen masthead, standing directly behind Ahab, though slightly lower than him, with a deep gulf of air between them. But already the black wing was before the old man's eyes. The long, hooked beak was at his head. With a screech, the black hawk flew away with his prize. An eagle flew 3 times around Tarquin's head, taking off his cap to replace it, and then Tanaquil, his wife, declared that Tarquin would be king of Rome. But only by the replacement of the cap was that omen considered good. Ahab's hat was never returned. The wild hawk flew on with it, far ahead of the prow, and eventually disappeared, while from the point of its disappearance, a small black spot could be faintly seen, falling from that great height into the sea.